Good morning and welcome to this definitive edition or presentation on lockdown in South Africa. My name is Piet Leroux and I represent the Business for Ending Lockdown campaign. Business for Ending Lockdown is a campaign by several business organizations with a combined membership of more than 50,000 businesses. And over the past week, we've been gathering great support and many stories on our website at endlockdown.co.za, where business people and people who've borne the brunt of lockdown come to tell their stories and to lend their support to our very simple call. Number one, we want lockdown to end. Number two, we want the state of disaster lifted. And number three, we want all regulations converted to voluntary recommendations. That's the way to get the economy going, to save lives, and to get back to normal. Today, we, as Business for Ending Lockdown, are host to a wonderful group of people who have done wonderful work over the past few months, initially against the skeptics, to tell us that COVID-19's statistics and numbers and impact on lives and livelihoods are much different from what we were initially told in March, when the country was asked to and told to comply with a 3-week lockdown. We are now 6 months into it, but the group at PANDA, or Pandemic Data Analysis, led by coordinator Nick Hudson, who's also CEO at Sana Partners and an actuary, together with his colleagues, such as who will also be joined by today, Russell Lamberti, who's a strategist at ETM Macro Advisors, and also from TransUnion, the head of emerging markets at TransUnion Africa, Hans Zacher. Today, these gentlemen will tell us about the effects of lockdown on lives, on the economy, on credit, what its impact has been, and why it is important to end lockdown, not only because it is not helpful, it is futile, but also because of its impact is more deleterious than the COVID-19 itself. Now, I will introduce them to you shortly, and in order of speaking today will be Nick Hudson first. He will be followed by Hans Zacher, and then we will have Russell Lamberti. All of this will be wrapped up in an hour from now, where we will have a Q&A. So please feel free to, where you're following the stream, post comments in whether it's YouTube or on Twitter or on Facebook, and we'll post those comments as questions to the speakers after an hour's time. Then finally, without any further ado, I'll hand over to Nick Hudson. Nick, thank you very much for the hard work and the great work you've been doing to bring light to a very confusing situation that has cost us much over the past 6 months. Nick Hudson.
Thank you very much, Pitt, and good morning to all the viewers and to my fellow speakers. I'm going to plow straight into it, and I have one request for all of the listeners. And that is that I would like you to forget everything you know about coronavirus, everything you think you know about coronavirus, I should say. And I will warn you in advance, there are some surprising and for some people disturbing findings in our work here. So get ready for a bit of a ride. The key points that PANDA's been making over the last 4 or 5 months are as follows: that first of all, the coronavirus impact, as it was modeled and projected by various organizations all over the world, was completely overestimated. The second one is that when it came time for South Africa to enter its epidemic, we failed to take cognizance of all the international experience that was around by then. And as a result, our government's advisors got the whole pattern of the epidemic, not only its magnitude, but also its duration, completely wrong. We contend from the start that the economic and mortality impact of lockdown was not being fully recognized, or even recognized at all. The conversation at the start, when lockdown was extremely popular, if you remember, was that this was a question of trading lives for money or lives for the economy, and how could anybody do that? But we brought it to everybody's attention that the economy simply mediates life. So when you shatter an economy, you find yourself in the domain of playing the game of trading lives for lives. And then our later work also found that the lockdown benefits are non-existent. And I say that without qualification, because our more recent work has even shown that lockdowns may exacerbate coronavirus mortality. Our story starts in February with this boat, the Diamond Princess. It was a tragic story. Here was a boat with a deadly virus storming around it. The Japanese authorities wouldn't even let the boat dock initially. So scared were they that the virus would make landfall on their territory. But if you look past the headlines and the tragic story, what this boat represented was what we call a petri dish, an opportunity to see how the virus will evolve in a closed population. And, this is a very fortunate position to be in as a scientist, to be able to look at this information. It may take you years after the virus has gone around the real world to work out exactly how it behaves. But here you had a population of 3,700 people, and it took them 15 days to do anything in terms of lockdown, social distancing, all that kind of thing. So we got a really good look at how this virus was going to behave. When I say we, I'm talking about the people who initially formed PANDA, and I would say a handful of researchers in the rest of the world. The mainstream epidemiologists had their attention firmly focused on China, and they were buying into the whole Chinese story of lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. And what this boat told us is that this disease was actually not a particularly severe disease. In particular, it didn't affect anybody on the boat under the age of 65, even though the very large crew complement of some 2,000, I think, people did have no ability to isolate. They were living in quite dense bunk room accommodations and so on. So we learned quickly, this is not a disease that affects young people. And we also got a clear view of the mortality for older people. Only 12 people out of the 3,700 on board died, despite the virus having had enough time to go all the way around that boat. And many showed no symptoms. The majority showed no symptoms when they were infected. So you got a clear picture of a disease that was mild for most people and had a fairly low mortality rate. And you could infer from that experience on the boat what it would look like on dry land in real countries. You did that by simply adjusting the age-based mortality on the boat for the population age structure of a country. It's not a very difficult calculation. You can do it in a little spreadsheet. And we did this and produced a series of numbers called the Diamond Princess numbers. And our estimate of that for South Africa was 20,000 deaths might result, which sounds like a lot when you just roll it off the tongue like this. But in the context of a country that experiences on average 450,000 deaths a year, and typically somewhere between 10 and 20,000 deaths from the flu, it didn't sound like a particularly bad story. And we were very surprised, therefore, to hear the World Health Organization come out with a completely different read. We call this tweet the costliest misrepresentation in world history. Both sentences in this tweet are correct. The first sentence, globally, about 3.4% of reported coronavirus cases have died. Correct. By comparison, seasonal flu generally kills far fewer than 1% of those infected. Also correct, and indeed most people think it's about 0.1%. But by conflating cases with infections, Tedros was misleading the world in a very severe fashion. Cases represent those people who are infected, who are sick enough to arrive at a hospital, whereas infections include a vast majority of people who don't go anywhere near a hospital. You know, if you've had flu before, it will very seldom have taken you to hospital. And by making this conflation between the 3.4% and the flu, which has a 0.1% mortality rate, a lot of people heard this as meaning that coronavirus was 34 times as deadly as the flu. And all over the world, people punched in the world population of about 8 billion people and multiplied it by 3.4% and concluded that tens of millions of people would die. Along with that came this message, which we've all come to loathe, the message, test, test, test. Further fuel was added to this fire on the 16th of March, pretty much ending life as we know it, really, when Professor Neil Ferguson at the Imperial College produced a model that predicted that as many as 500,000 people would die in the UK and 2.2 million people in the US. Massive overestimates, more than an order of magnitude. Now, Ferguson had been implicated in prediction of 6 epidemics that failed to materialize, including the foot and mouth outbreak in the UK that led to an extraordinary number of animals being put down, and devastation in the agricultural sector there. There were farmers committing suicide. It was a terrible scene, and it was all for nothing. Similarly with the swine flu panic. Why we listened to the guy this time around, I don't know, but the whole world did, and what ensued was lockdown all over the place. And this is where the story gets really strange, and I'm pretty sure that this is new information for you. I'll draw your attention first to the bottom paper here. In the New England Journal of Medicine, none other than Anthony Fauci, the high priest of lockdown panic in the United States, produced a paper in which he concluded that the consequences of coronavirus may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal flu, which has a case fatality rate of approximately 0.1%. And similarly, at the same time, or roughly the same time, week before, the UK government concluded that, having studied the disease, the mortality rates for coronavirus were low overall, and came to the conclusion that it should no longer be categorized as a high consequence infectious disease. These are stunning revelations for most people. Why the panic? If leading authorities in the discipline of epidemiology had already concluded in March that we were correct in our interpretation of the Diamond Princess information, and this disease was not the deadly killer it was thought to be. In the same way that the UK had its Ferguson, we had our modelers in South Africa, and they were quick to produce the same kind of bad science, predicting as many as 351,000 deaths in South Africa. It took a long time, several months, for the world to produce that many deaths, and South Africa only has 1% of the world's population. And we believe that when confronted with this information, and along with the news that that might result in a shortage of as many as 1 million hospital beds, Ramaphosa's path was set, and the state of disaster and lockdown followed. All of this was helped along with a great deal of panic in the media. You've all seen headlines like this, including scare tactics around children, which is truly ridiculous. The mortality rate for children from coronavirus is virtually zero. So confronted with South Africa's lockdown, and then after 3 weeks, its extension, the group of people that by then had formed PANDA felt that they needed to do something. We saw in lockdown an existential crisis for the country, and indeed for life as we know it all over the world. Yet the lockdown was still incredibly popular. Everybody thought that it was fantastic what leadership the president was demonstrating for the first time since his inauguration. And we were looking at this thing with horror. So we approached the exercise by producing a paper that attempted to quantify the loss of life that might stem from lockdown. And we tried to do it in a way that favored the argument for lockdown. Notwithstanding that, we came to the conclusion that lockdown would cause a loss of life at least 30 times greater than the loss of life it stood to prevent. And that we did with standard actuarial techniques that are used to price insurance policies all over the world, and that have been used for the better part of 100 years. Very standard actuarial techniques. Now, just by way of a little preparation for the slides that are to come, I just want to highlight a couple of features here, because there's a lot of conversation that takes place about deaths and cases and infections, and we need to be clear what we're talking about. So this is a schematic. It doesn't represent any particular country. It's kind of an average for a seriously affected country. And what we show here, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner there's a tiny block which represents deaths. That is approximately 300 per million is the number that you should compare if you're used to looking at the stats online. 0.03% of the population will die from coronavirus. And the cases, which you read about all the time, will represent approximately 1% of the population. Okay? And you can see there the case fatality of approximately 3%, 0.03 over 1%. But that's a small part of a much bigger picture. Wherever antibody tests have been done on a randomized basis anywhere in the world, so Sweden, New York, India, many, many countries now, we get this finding that approximately 20% of the population will demonstrate the presence of antibodies, suggesting that they've been infected. And so that group is obviously much bigger than the number of cases. You know, in most countries, anywhere between 6 times and 200 times the size of the number of of official cases or confirmed cases. But there's yet another group, which are people who, once they become infected, don't go on to generate antibodies. The infection is so mild that they only generate what's known as a cellular immune reaction or a T-cell reaction. That's in response to a topical infection. So maybe something in the upper respiratory tract, a sore throat or so. And they may not even notice the infection, or it may be so mild that they just can't believe that they've got coronavirus. And that's a bigger group, or so we think at the moment, than the seropositive people, or the people who have a serious enough disease to go on and produce antibodies. And so, you know, this number of 30% could even be much bigger, by the way. It could be that as many as 80% of the population get exposed to the virus and don't develop an antibody response, just literally bounce it off them using their normal cellular immune reaction. But depending on how you define the infected group, you get vastly different fatality rates, as you can see on the top right there. The case fatality rate of 3% is representation of the people who arrive ill at hospital. And the other groups are dependent on how exactly you define the infected population. But you see there, they're all fractions of 1% and maybe even fractions of 0.1%. So this news that you hear about South Africa ranking 6th in case numbers, yeah, it's true. But first of all, we're 13th in terms of deaths, number of deaths. And of course, you need to standardize by the size of the population. So deaths per million of population, we rank 23rd. But if you look back to that slide, what's the meaning of that? Okay, what does it mean that we rank 23rd? Well, here we can see how South Africa stacks up against other countries. 23rd in the world. Our estimate of 10 to 20,000 deaths, derived from the Diamond Princess analysis and a scrutiny of overseas experience, would put us exactly in the range where we are, compared to, say, Peru and Belgium, which occupy the first 2 places that both have more than 800 deaths per million. South Africa is sitting at just over 200 deaths per million. Now, government's modelers have had a model in place since May, which they updated and then withdrew the update. So the May model still stands. They're predicting 40 to 50,000 deaths in South Africa, never updated. Okay, that would put us in line with the worst countries in the world. And there's a good reason why to expect that we wouldn't be in line with the worst countries in the world, and that is we have a much younger population. And you will remember that I pointed out that this is a disease that fundamentally affects the old people much more than it affects the youth. Indeed, South Africa has a old population about 20 or 25% the size of that of Belgium, and even half that the size of Brazil. So that gives us a lot of reason to expect that South Africa would produce lower ultimate mortality than a nation like Belgium. The other thing we noticed from quite an early stage was that there was a massive disparity in global experience. This was very much an epidemic of the Americas and then Northwestern and Southern Europe. The rest of the world has a combined average fatality rate here, population fatality rate, of approximately 25 or 30 per million, which doesn't even reach the threshold for describing it as an epidemic. There are some countries, I think there's 3 countries, that have not yet had a death from coronavirus. And that's very strange. It's implausible that they never had an infected person walk on their soil. This is a disease that has spread around the world. There are no countries that well, barring a few very remote islands, there are no countries that haven't had a coronavirus case. So we decided that a better way to approach the mortality and to understanding the impact on the country would, instead of just building a model using assumptions that we've plucked out of the sky for South Africa, we would look and try and understand what the causes of this different mortality were. And we came up with a not too surprising finding that the three main issues were: how old is your population, and how much comorbidity do you have in the population, and how much obesity do you have in the population. Obesity is an independent factor. But now for the bad news. When we put lockdown into that model to see if that made a difference, and we use a data series called the Oxford Lockdown Stringency Index, we found that there was no relationship. That chart on the right is the relationship between the stringency of lockdown and the deaths per million of a country. There is no relationship. That is a statistical paint splat of no relevance. Lockdown does not determine how many people die. Neither does it determine how long it takes to get to your peak. In other words, there was no curve flattening effect that we could see. And given that the whole purpose of lockdown had ostensibly been to flatten the curve and give hospitals time to prepare, this we found quite an astonishing finding. It surprised us. Just to illustrate again, if you don't like statistics and scatter plots, this is a chart that a little animation with average deaths per million on the x-axis. So in other words, how hard a country is hit by coronavirus, and on the y-axis, an estimate of the lockdown stringency in that country. And this is how it evolves over the weeks.
And they're often racing in social distance. He left out about 1.5 metres in front of the rest of them. He goes straight to the front social distance, mustering some speed on the inside. Thank God they're still racing. Up there as well in the early part, stock up on toilet paper and racing very keen in the early stages is Wash Your Hands Jeffrey. A couple of lengths away, then the golf is an exercise from Quick Get On a Centrelink who settles midfield.
Okay, and if you're seeing in that if you're seeing in that bad news for countries that didn't lock down, well, I'd be very surprised. Another surprising thing for most people is that prior to coronavirus, the science was unanimous. You can find all over the place in the World Health Organization, at the US Center for Disease Control, in any number of epidemiological journals, this opinion that quarantines, which is the word that we used before coronavirus for lockdown, quarantines should be eliminated from serious consideration, that the effects are so severe that they should never be contemplated, that schools should not be closed in response to influenza epidemics, that screening and quarantining of passengers will not substantially delay virus introduction, and even that masks outside of hospital settings accomplish little, if anything. So there's a hell of a lot of science before coronavirus, and we ask, why did it all change? Another way of looking at this is if you drill down into the South African experience. Here's Cape Town, the southern suburbs at the top, and Khayelitsha at the bottom. And the obvious difference between these two places is that whereas the wealthy are very able to socially distance, the poor in Khayelitsha are not. And what do you see there? Very similar pattern on the way up in terms of how the infection penetrates the community, and then a faster route down in the community that's least able to socially distance. Again, just suggesting that lockdown doesn't have an effect. And yet, what does the World Health Organization say, the organization that set off the stampede and the panic? They say that you shouldn't release your lockdown until your health systems are able to detect, test, isolate, and treat every case and trace every contact, and 5 other conditions, none of which we believe are possible. So here's the organization that put us into lockdown, telling us not to leave it. Onto the models. I'm not going to make too much of this. Our models are available on our website, but we have managed to set up very simple models that have described this epidemic to a T. If you look at this Western Cape one, which is the most progressed story, you'll see that we're actually on the dot relative to our estimate, which we made in 10 June. And from those models, we were also able to reach reasonably accurate resource estimates. there's a lot of virtue in this kind of simplicity that we use. We don't get complicated and try to model every probability on every transmission probability and everybody's infection. We look at the overseas experience, what are the patterns that we're seeing, and we fit very simple curves and project them. And we can do that quite early on. And there's a lot of virtue to that simplicity because you can change the models very easily. And this is how this pans out. On the 12th of June, the SA Coronavirus Modeling Consortium issued a model. And that model, we took one look at it. We were hoping that they were going to moderate their May model, and we were very disappointed. Despite the massive confidence intervals that they were projecting over the course of the next month and a half, they were still forecasting a tragedy of epic proportions compared to what we were seeing. And so we sent them immediately on the day, for the first time publishing one of our models, our Western Cape curve, which you can see in the bottom right. Now, that curve has such narrow confidence intervals that you can barely see the curve behind the actual numbers, which are those red dots that emerged over the course of the next month. And we, at the same time, predicted that the NICD's model would be breached. The lower confidence interval would be breached on the 13th of July. We were wrong by a day. It breached on the 12th. And compared to that, this model of ours, which is still in place, and to this day, in some, 2.5 months later, is still tracking down its center line. A huge, just in us, breach of scientific method, a application of bad science by the authorities. And there goes the May model in its full context being breached by the actual deaths. That's the previous model of the consortium. But more seriously, I mean, what is the use of estimating deaths? Surely you are trying to estimate hospital resources. And this is what that picture looks like. It's even worse. Beds and ICU beds were overestimated by these models, even by their most optimistic cases, in a range of 13 to 29 times too much. And the result of that is the same thing we've seen elsewhere in the world: massive, massive misallocation of resources. A 6-month lease was just signed by the Western Cape government on a facility in Brackengate. Just as we proposed that herd immunity had been reached in the Western Cape, that facility will barely be used. And it wasn't government that was the only person doing these crazy modeling exercises. Business for South Africa came out roughly on the day that South Africa peaked, predicting that there was to be a surge in cases and mortalities that would continue until late August. Couldn't have been more wrong and more unfortunately timed. So let's put this more moderate epidemic in context. At 14,000 odd deaths at the moment in South Africa, this ranks below low respiratory infections, normal death rates for the year, and way below the death rates from other causes of communicable diseases like HIV. South Africa has 450,000 deaths a year. In the time that coronavirus has been around with us, some 250,000 people have died in South Africa. So perspective is really needed. Similarly, on a world scale, only 2% of the deaths in the world this year have been around coronavirus, and that's probably a dramatic overestimate. The official cases we feel include many deaths that aren't really caused by coronavirus. And you can see there that by the end of the year, this won't even be in the top 10 of causes of death worldwide. On the other hand, and this is what I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to talk to you about, the lockdown has been deadly. And headlines like this are starting to become part of our everyday reading material. This one in particular is gutting. UNICEF estimating that lockdown will kill more than coronavirus 19, as it predicts 1.2 million infant deaths. Just before I hand over to the guys, I want to address a serious question. All of these authorities who predicted disaster are embarrassed right now. And with the deaths not coming, they are all indulging in an absolute epidemic of scaremongering. You will have heard of second waves being spoken about on your televisions and radios. Ignore. This is what a second wave looks like. Belgium and France, a rash of testing amongst young and asymptomatic people, giving rise to lots of new cases. But as you can see on the bottom of those charts, no deaths. And there are other scaremongering tactics, long-term effects, which have been only seen in a handful of small groups of people with no attempt made to rule out pre-existing conditions. This business of getting reinfected. The 2 cases that have been found were both asymptomatic, which in a normal English use of the term immunity suggests that the people are immune. If exposed to the virus again, if the virus penetrates their cells, they don't get sick from it. So you do not need to be worried about reinfection. And all over the world, governments are beginning to realize that we are paying now for what has in fact not been an epidemic of coronavirus, but an epidemic of stupidity. So we anticipate that our original estimate, that 40 million years of lost life will ensue from lockdown, that estimate is still intact. We think that our government is going to struggle to raise money. We think that the academia is going to be fighting over these issues for years to come, and that there's going to be a lot of institutional fallout. Just before I hand over to Hans for his section of his presentation, this is his starting slide. I just want to leave you with the message. This stuff that you're going to see now is quite devastating, and it's very hard to swallow some of it. But it's important to, I think, for everybody to understand the full magnitude of what lockdown has done. And so, I find this stuff fascinating, as tough as it is to read. Over to you, Hans.
Thanks, Nick, and morning to everyone. So what I'd like to take you through is a bit of a discussion about what is actually happening in the South African economy within our businesses. So as the Bureau, we track all major businesses as well as the smaller SME sector per se. Just to understand, on a general course, even before lockdown, how are the businesses doing? How are they conducting themselves in the market? And what's the overall financial health in terms of being able to grant credit? Now, the first thing to highlight is just to give a sense of the overall makeup of the South African economy. Now, what we have at the bottom of this graph is we track about 8,800 large and public enterprises. Then we have about 38,900 medium-sized organizations. But then you need to look at the small to medium companies, the SMMEs, both those that are registered, which are those 340,000, so those are the formal, registered, pay tax type entities, as well as the informal sole prop world, which actually numbers about estimates between 1.7 million and 2.5 million entities in the country. Now, what you'll notice is that within that red block, that actually provides a disproportionate, perhaps in the minds of a lot of people, a disproportionate contribution to the total economic activity. In that these businesses are estimated to constitute 40% of our corporate turnover, as much as 40 to 60% of our GDP, and about 10 million, let's call them jobs, providing employment and income for about 10 million people. But most importantly, this segment constitutes 60 to 80% of our growth aspiration in terms of our national development plan and our overall economic growth. So when we talk about business, what we really need to start doing is look at the overall economy as well as the health of this particular segment, which tends to get harder hit by changes in the economy, as well as you'll see in the lockdown environment and during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what I'll show you in the next couple of slides is we've done 3 things. The first thing is we want to understand, well, what is the sentiment of our SMME community? How are they feeling and what are they doing? And how are they adapting during lockdown? Then we need to understand that each one of these SMME services a consumer base, and they themselves as consumers, they're business owners running a business to provide incomes for themselves and their family. And then finally, we'll start to talk about what are we actually seeing in terms of the financial performance or the credit performance of these entities in the market. So firstly, when we surveyed a large proportion of the SME community, what we found, and these surveys come in towards the end of July, is that 9 out of 10 businesses are really struggling or temporarily closed. Only 9% are operating as normal, and only 1% are thriving. But I guess more worrying is just the sentiment of these business owners. If you look at the right-hand side, I mean, the first thing to point out is 24% just didn't know whether they would survive, the next couple of months, where, 6% believed they would survive less than a month, 26% less than 3 months, and 17% less than 6 months. So that's, just under half our business community not believing that they'll last longer than 6 months, and a further 24% just really worried about their continued survival. Now, if you look at the pains they're going through from a business perspective, the next question to ask is, well, how concerned are you in being able to meet your financial obligations and keep your business running? And 50% and 25% extremely concerned, very concerned about meeting those payment obligations. And on the right-hand side, that manifests itself in that 59%, unable to meet staff and payroll, 44%, not able to meet their rental obligations. And then you'll see it going down into things like telco services, rental and equipment. And the thing to note here is that these businesses are unable to afford the very things that help them to be a sustainable business and continue to operate during this period. So we then asked, well, to what extent have you received some level of support? So the first thing to note, if you add up the various mechanisms, be it UIF, payment holidays, credit extensions, discounts, and the like, the important one to note there is the 27% that, during that period, only 27% of our businesses received no support whatsoever. Now, that may be a combination of they didn't need it or they didn't know how to apply, but largely you're seeing a business community that did receive some support in some way, shape, or form during the period. But the important point to note, and we particularly saw it in the comments coming back, is that in terms of these support mechanisms, a lot of businesses were unable to start accessing them for various reasons, most notably that a lot of the support mechanisms were depleted. So the initial funds offered by private individuals and the likes went very quickly. And it kind of showed that this wasn't a sustainable model to continue these businesses in an artificially sort of supported way. So if you look to the right, what do you need to continue to survive? These businesses are looking for improved cash flow. They're looking to attract new customers. They're looking for funding. They want to diversify the customer base. So in an environment where consumers are strapped, funds are being depleted quite quickly, the challenge with a picture like this is that these businesses are looking for things in the market that are perhaps in very short supply. So, it really looks to see, well, how will these businesses survive? How will they continue to operate during these tough conditions? So if we switch across to the consumer view of the world, as I said, these SMEs are serving both B2B and B2C environments, as well as their consumers in their own right. And what you see is that when we surveyed general consumers, 80% of consumers indicated they were negatively impacted. 91% were concerned about paying their bills. 39% had their work hours reduced. And the latest stats, we run these surveys quite often, is that 20% of consumers have lost their jobs. So the net impact of all of those things is that 34% of consumers are unable to pay their bills, with an average shortfall of just over 6,700 Rand on their monthly obligations. So it really points to a consumer community that is equally strapped. So unfortunately, if you look at it in terms of income band, who's the most affected, and you'll see, as probably expected, the lowest income earners, 45%, are the ones that are most, impacted the most by this COVID impact. And as you see, it kind of depletes as you go up the salary bands. In terms of industry, probably quite intuitive: construction, food services, manufacturing, is where people lost their jobs, most prevalently. So, for working for restaurants, working construction or manufacturing is where that happened. And then on the right-hand side, talking to the SMME community as well, is that unfortunately of the consumers that are the most impacted, 60% of them are working for those SMMEs, so those companies of less than 100 people. So you see this concentration of financial difficulty of the employees of those communities struggling once again within the SMME community. And to reference back, roughly about 40 to 60% of economic activity in the space. So that really talks to the overall sentiment. So a lot of negativity, a lot of not knowing what to do next, some discussion about reinvention and transforming, but as you saw, only 1% are thriving. So if we actually start looking at the risk in the base, so this is a bureau view, essentially predicting to what extent is the overall community likely to default on their obligations. So you'll see that from a public entity perspective, almost negligible change in risk in the public sector. Our large organizations moving from Q1 to Q2, also a marginal increase. So there are some high-profile defaults happening in the market that you've most likely seen. But generally, we're seeing that the large entities are weathering the storm well. Where the pain is being felt is in the medium to small segments. So if you look at the red, the sort of high probability or the high risk probability of defaults, the orange, which is medium, and the green, which is looking at a good state. From a Q1 to a Q2 perspective, you've seen a significant growth in the financial distress and risk within those entities. Now, what you also need to realize is that when we look at these small to medium businesses, we're not just looking at the health of the business itself. We're also looking at the health of the principals, the business owners, in that the financial health of the business is very closely tied to the financial health of the business. And what you typically see is a 3-month lag, that when the business starts getting into distress, start defaulting on its obligations, 3 months later, the principal, the business owner, will feel the same distress, and vice versa. When the principal is looking for distress, because oftentimes you see the principals funding the business through personal loans and the like, 3 months later, you see the business ending up in financial distress and showing up in our bureau. So just to note that this is a trended view. So this looks at the overall behaviors in the market and predicts that, within those bands, we're going to start seeing a lot more defaults of these organizations in the market. So if we look at the actual performance versus the predictive bands that we've outlined, so typically, last year, June, the general churn or default in the market is about 4.08% of credit obligations by businesses is not met. Now, what we've seen through the June and the August timeframe is that's increased to about 6.4% chance of default, or actual defaults in the market. Now, what we also need to recognize is in the small to medium community, we tend to see that these businesses, as you see from the previous slide, they've had a certain level of support. They've had the grants, they've had the UIF, they've had payment holidays. Now, that uptick in risk is when all of those payment holidays and those obligations are starting to become due within the August timeframe. So we expect to see a tick up. And right now you're seeing that 6.4%. If our trajectories are right, we expect to stay within those bands. So that just gives you a sense of the overall pain being felt out there in the economic community. But I think we just need to recognize that, just to repeat, these SMMEs represent our best chance of growth, economic growth, and the best chance of job creation in the market. So, an SME community in trouble really illustrates the challenge that we have from an overall economic growth perspective. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Russell to take us through just the overall economic views and what he's seeing in the market as well.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Nick. It's great to join everyone. I'm currently sitting in my office and being assailed by a huge Cape Town storm. So I hope that's not too noisy for everyone. And I hope it's not too much of a metaphor for what we're facing economically. I would like to kick off and just make some very strong points about what we've been going through economically, particularly around this concept of locking down. And shutting down massive swathes of economic activity. And the first point is that, you know, when we're thinking about a health crisis, when we're thinking about public health, we have to understand that the economy itself is a life support machine. This is why, this is how and why we get up every day to provide for ourselves, for our families, to trade with one another, to make our lives better, to improve our quality of life, to improve our health, to afford healthcare services. This is all supported by the economy. The notion that you can shut down the very thing that sustains lives and livelihoods, I think has been a huge miscalculation, and really a huge misunderstanding of what the economy is. The economy isn't some sort of cold, money-making machine for greedy capitalists. The economy, this network of production and exchange is precisely how we live. So turning this machine off, I think, does immense social damage. Lockdown has thrust millions of people into economic uncertainty. We are still trying to calculate the damage, and in many ways it's still incalculable, in the sense that things are still in a tremendous state of flux. The second quarter, April, May, June, we know has been the worst period. That's when the economy was locked down the hardest. That's when certainly many service sector jobs, many restaurant jobs, entertainment sector, tourism sector jobs, construction, many hundreds of thousands of jobs were at least temporarily lost during that quarter. Now, some of those jobs are clearly clawing back, because as the economy opens up, that activity is allowed to take place again. So when we talk about job losses, it's important that we acknowledge that there are certain job losses that are temporary. Some are going to be more permanent. Some are going to take longer to filter through in the data. So many people didn't lose their jobs in April, May, or June, but may now be facing job insecurity through the course of July, August, September, and through the rest of this year and into next year. So I think that's a critical dimension to this. And then finally, so that's why I talk about economic uncertainty. It's not just that some people lost their jobs, which is certainly a terrible consequence of this, but it's really that everyone faces income uncertainty right now. Everyone faces job insecurity, business insecurity, and that, of course, affects future planning. It affects investment decisions, and it affects how we use our savings and how we plan. And finally, when we look ahead to getting out of this mess, it's not only about ending lockdown, but it's also about restoring household and business savings. We don't talk about savings enough in the public discourse, but it's only really from a place of savings that we can produce anything. You have to use savings to invest in the productive process, to have working capital for your business, to invest in hiring staff so that you can get productive again. So those are critically important points. The chart you're looking at here is a chart that combines the Oxford stringency data that Nick Hudson spoke about earlier. That's an index compiled by Oxford University researchers of how stringent a country's lockdown was. Google, through cell phone tracking, can also track at a meta level people's mobility. Okay, we might think that's a bit creepy, but it does give us some useful aggregate data. If you combine those two measures, and we put those two measures into an index that ranges from 0 to 100. The closer you are to 0, the less locked down and fearful you are, the more mobile the country is. The closer you are to 100, the more heavily locked down the more fearful and the less mobile, the more immobile a country is. And you can see South Africa is the bright pink line there. I've highlighted it so we can see South Africa. And I've put South Africa with a range of other countries. Right at the bottom, you can see Japan and Sweden. South Africa is right near the top, along with Argentina and India. We've actually seen, quite interestingly, emerging markets, large emerging markets like Mexico, Argentina, South Africa, Peru, Colombia, and various other places have locked down quite heavily. And there's an interesting dynamic about why some of these big emerging markets have done that. But the main thing to take home here is that, in the second quarter, South Africa was among the most heavily locked down and immobile economies in the world. That's the first point. The second point is how long it's taking for South Africa to get back to normal. And I think that's a function of a number of things. It's a function of the lockdown taking a long time to be lifted. We still face certain significant restrictions. There's still a curfew. There's still a complete international travel ban in and out of the country, barring very, very few select people who can move. So we're taking a long time to come out, whereas you can see some countries, they locked down quite heavily initially, but they've come out much, much quicker. Okay. The chart you're looking at here is a chart on the x-axis, which is the bottom axis, is the Oxford stringency, the average Oxford stringency score, okay, between 0 and 100. So the higher you are on this chart, the further to the right, the more locked down you were. The y-axis, which is the axis on the left-hand side of the chart, is the quarter-on-quarter change in GDP. And the blue dots are what happened to countries in the first quarter of the year, and the red dots are what happened to countries in the second quarter of the year. And again, this is a range of important economies in the developed and emerging market world. Those two red dots, right near the bottom right-hand side of the chart, belong to Peru and India, both emerging markets that locked down very, very strongly. South Africa has had a very, very similar lockdown to them. And we think that South Africa is probably on track for a similar kind of GDP outcome in the second quarter, which is to say that GDP could fall anywhere from 20 to 30 and possibly worse percent. So let's round that off to about a 25% decline in GDP. A full quarter of our GDP gets potentially knocked off in the second quarter. Why are we still making that estimate instead of actually looking at real data? Because Stats SA hasn't released the second quarter GDP data yet. That's still to come out. So we still have to make guesstimates and estimates of where we think that's going to come out. But based on the severity of our lockdown, and unfortunately the irrationality of so many of the lockdown rules, you'll remember e-commerce was banned until mid-May, I think, or late May. I mean, e-commerce was the perfect industry to thrive in a lockdown situation, in a social distancing situation. That was banned for a month and a half of lockdown. There were some crazy rules around what you could and couldn't buy from supermarkets and so on. So I think South Africa probably faced a really, really bad second quarter. Why does this matter? One of the reasons it matters is because it helps us to get a perspective on where we think the overall economic contraction could be this year. And we're looking in that kind of -10 to -15% range, probably closer to -15, particularly if we have a bad second quarter outcome of around a 30% decline. That's significant because the central bank and the National Treasury are only forecasting for the year a -7% contraction. So it's possible that the reality is shaping up to be twice as bad as that forecast. Let me put those numbers into additional context. Let's round off to a 15% contraction for the year if we were to see that. Let's compare that to the global financial crisis of 2008. During that time, South Africa's recession was quite bad, if you'll recall, 2008 and 2009. The peak to trough GDP decline in that period was just 2%. 2% GDP decline, which is a big recession, but nowhere near a 10 to 15% decline, which we should strictly call a depression. We are in a depression. Lockdown has caused and is causing an economic depression, and almost certainly will cause an economic depression through the course of the rest of this year. So it's important to put the numbers into context. Now, of course, we know that there's been this incredibly sharp decline, but what about recovery? Because as you unlock the economy, you would expect a fast recovery. And indeed, through the course of June and July, we do indeed see a very rapid recovery. In fact, even starting in May. Okay, so we know that April, we'll all think back to April. April was the most heavily locked down month. That was the first wave of lockdown. It was lockdown level 5. Everyone had to stay at home. Very few industries could operate. So we would naturally expect to see a quick bounce from that. And you do indeed see that. So the chart you're looking at here is a bar chart. All those red bars are stuck together. Those represent vehicle sales, passenger car sales in South Africa per month. So prior to lockdown, South Africa was selling around about 30,000 passenger cars per month. You can see over the last 15 years that black dotted line is the trend. South Africa wasn't in a great trend. We basically didn't grow vehicle sales for a decade and a half. Lockdown hit, and you'll see that little gap right at the end of that chart where the red lines kind of disappeared briefly, and that was April. We sold about 100 vehicles in the month of April. So essentially no vehicles were sold. Okay. Car dealerships, many car dealerships have had to close. Car sales have come under tremendous pressure. Now, there's been a recovery through the course of May and June, but worryingly, and I think this is the most important point, worryingly, since June, we've actually seen sales start to stabilize at around that 20,000 units per month mark, whereas you would have hoped and expected a stronger recovery back to the 30,000 level as we come out of lockdown. So that's concerning. Now, vehicles are a very useful barometer for consumer credit health, for household finances, for confidence in the future, buying a new car, going into debt. And what's interesting about that is, let's also not forget that interest rates have been slashed dramatically by the Reserve Bank over the last few months. So for car sales to only have recovered to 2/3 of their prior volume, in other words, they're still about 33% down. In fact, probably a little more. In fact, if you look at this chart, they're probably about nearly 40% down still, 35% down. With such low interest rates, tells you about the pain that is still being endured in this market. And I think that's something that we've got to be really concerned about. Now, of course, that pain additionally translates into weak tax revenue growth. For a government that is already cash strapped, we have got a tax revenue implosion. And the bad news is that spending is not really being cut at all. And so the net effect is that the South African government is incurring enormous debts in 2020. So the chart you're looking at here is denominated in trillions of rands, okay? In other words, the blue line there is up at about 1.7, nearly 1.8 trillion rand. That's an annualized estimate of how much the government spends every year, okay? And in fact, it's going to rise as the course of 2020 goes on. The estimate is that government will spend around 2 trillion rand in its budget this year. The problem is that on an annualized basis, it's only collecting at the moment about 1 trillion. We've seen a colossal collapse in tax revenue over the last few months, from around about 1.4 trillion to about 1 trillion on an annualized basis. What you can see in those two lines is that the red line was already starting to underperform through the course of 2018 and 19. It was already deviating from that dotted trend there, whereas the spending chart has continued to climb. And that gap is called government debt. And government takes that debt on behalf of us, the taxpayer. And therefore, in the future, we're going to be required to continue paying very high taxes. And the other risk is that government will start funding these deficits by printing money or by resorting to other violations of property rights. For example, using prescribed assets, where they force pension funds to invest in government bonds in a greater to a greater degree. And so there's various risks that now come with such a huge fiscal deficit, not least of which is just a complete default and fiscal crisis, which would be very, very detrimental to the currency as well. So lockdown has tremendous knock-on implications right through the economic system. And then finally, you're looking at a chart here. I'm not going to spend long on this. I'm going to spend a very brief time on this to say the bottom axis is the change in lockdown stringency over the last 3 months. Countries that are lined up closer to the left-hand side of this chart are countries that are actually opening up a lot faster. And then the countries that are at the bottom of this chart, which is the side axis, are the countries that contracted the most. Okay, so the United Kingdom and Peru have contracted a lot, but they're also engaged in relatively faster opening ups now of their economic systems. Italy is another good example. Italy and Russia in particular. South Africa is likely to suffer a very, very sharp decline, but at the moment we're not opening up fast enough. There's still too much lockdown. There's still too many lockdown laws, but also too much fear and too much misinformation about opening up the economic system again. And unfortunately for me, that the concern there is therefore that the economic recovery that we can expect to see is not going to be strong, particularly if you consider the fact that we rely on these other countries for our recovery. The whole global system needs to recover for the South African economy to recover. And what you can see is that a lot of those countries are lined up still too far to the right-hand side of that chart, meaning lockdowns are still being too slowly relinquished. Okay, so what is the bottom line? So I think the implications are the following. There is no question that when you suffer an economic depression of the magnitude that is staring us in the face right now, poverty and social and political unrest and instability have to go up. Health outcomes must worsen as a result. Poverty, the lack of access to good nutrition, to safe, warm accommodation, these things worsen health outcomes. Fiscal and currency risk is going up. The fiscal deficit is climbing tremendously. And in a country that's very poor, that's heavily indebted, and that has a number of social and political problems, that puts additional pressure on the currency. This is not a currency prediction. This is not telling you that the rand is imminently going to weaken, but we have to consider that currency risk remains. And the rand is hardly a strong currency at 17 odd rand to the dollar. Business risk clearly goes up, and Hans highlighted some of that very, very clearly in the previous slides, in the previous presentation. Now, there will be some niche opportunities because the world around us is changing very rapidly. And as things get done differently, some businesses are going to find those little niches and latch onto them, and some smart, very innovative entrepreneurs are already doing that, and good on them for doing that. But if you pull back the lens, on the whole, this has been a devastating episode, and I think will continue to be a very, very difficult episode for small, medium, and large businesses. And in some respects, large businesses are particularly vulnerable, not in this particular way, in that many large businesses are very, very tied into the macroeconomy. They're so big that their sales revenue is very much tied into the macroeconomy. Small businesses can sometimes find little growth niches even in these very tough times. In terms of the path to recovery, there's just two key things to say. Business for Ending Lockdown is very, very clear that we need to end this lockdown now. Nick Hudson has brilliantly shown how this is a panic-demic rather than a pandemic. And ending the lockdown and getting people back to work as quickly as possible is critical. But once we end the lockdown, the second stage is that we have to restore private sector savings. We have to get back to strong household and business savings. And there's a number of policy recommendations that would entail. I'm not going to go into all those. We can perhaps deal with some of that in the Q&A. But it's absolutely critical that we allow household and businesses to restore and replenish savings, get back to trading, and get back on their feet again. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Nick Hudson. He's just going to wrap up with one final thought, and then we are done. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Russell. You've been an incredible analyst of the economic situation in South Africa, and right from the beginning, we've all been amazed at how accurately you've seen this unfolding story. Hans as well, thank you very much. It is brutal stuff, this impact. Unprecedented, other than at times of extreme war, really. And I think that can put all of us into more or less a state of depression. And I want to appeal to everybody now about what we can all do about this. It is bad what has happened to us in terms of civil liberties being taken away and the consequential impacts of the lockdown being so big in the face of a virus which has turned out to be much, all of that is in the past. What's required now is we have to get back to normal life. And even though this whole episode has been around taking away people's agency, whether by making them fearful or prohibiting them from getting about their daily lives, it's been about taking away agency. And we have to give that agency back to people, and we can all play a role in that. We need to help people get over the fear. It's an irrational fear. I see it in the eyes of people above their masks when I walk around the streets, that little shifting look of nervousness in so many faces. We need to address that. We need to all be part of the campaign to end the fear and to get things back to normal. Those charts that Russell was showing of the mobility being, I think, 25% below where it was at the beginning of the year, that's largely fear-driven. And we need to get over this stuff. Of course, we need to carry on pressing government, pressing all of the agencies that advise government, all of the modelers and the SAMRC and the MAC and the NICD, the whole alphabet soup of them. We need to press all the people involved in this to do the right thing and start speaking to South Africa to mitigate this fear so that we can get on with getting this economic recovery underway. That much is in our hands. And whether you own a small business or a restaurant or run a bed and breakfast or however small the business is, you can play a role in that. And I think it's important. It's a patriotic duty to do so. So I look forward to your questions, and we'll try and direct them in the right direction. I'm not the economics man.
To unmute, good. Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, Russell. And thank you very much, Hans, for this very informative presentation. It's clear from the comments that we've been watching, we've been streaming this to Twitter, to YouTube, to Facebook. And I see some people have even asked, where's our LinkedIn stream? The happy thought is that we can share this. This is all recorded, so it's there for watching and sharing. But thank you all for the very informative presentation, and Nick, for your call to action here
Sure.
at the end. This is exactly what we as Business for Ending Lockdown also think. We should get back to life as normal, move around and get the economy going. Just to remind everybody, all the viewers, we'll go into a quick Q&A now. I'll be posing some of the questions that have come through online, but if you're still if you're keen, please just put your question in the YouTube feed or in the comment section on Twitter, etc., and I'll pose them to the group. Business for Ending Lockdown is happy to host these gentlemen and PANDA for the great work they've been doing. We're an association of several business organizations with more than 50,000 members that say, and we're all saying, end lockdown, lift the state of disaster, and make all the recommendations, all the regulations, make them recommendations. People can make their own judgment calls, and businesses on health measures. Nick, if I start off with a quick question, then it is on the question of second waves. I'd like you to emphasize that point, or just expand a little bit on it. We're hearing about second waves. We're not seeing deaths, or are we in some places in the world seeing death in these second waves? Or why not? Why should we not be concerned about a second wave?
Good question, Pitt. There's three types of second wave observations that are made, and all of them are wrong, okay? The first one is the one that I showed in the presentation, where you get the case demics, as we call them, where you are testing young people who've recovered from the virus, and the test finds, corrupted particles of virus in their bodies. So they're not infectious, they're not sick. There's the slide, yeah. You see how the cases surge again, but there are no accompanying deaths. So that's the case demic version of the second wave theory. The other one is a little more subtle. You will see if you look at the American curve, there's a second hump. But what that represents is a very large landmass with the virus going through its epidemic curve at different places at different times. And when you superimpose two different curves, say one from New York and one from Texas, you get the appearance of there being a second wave. But in none of the underlying places do you get second waves. And sometimes you have to drill quite far down into the data. If you go and look at the epidemic curve for Louisiana, the state of Louisiana in the southern United States, what you see is in two of the parishes of Louisiana, they have parishes there because it used to be a French territory. It operates on a system of civil law. In Louisiana, those two parishes that house the Mardi Gras event every year had a peak around the same time as New York, because all the New Yorkers and people from the East Coast were visiting those parishes for the Mardi Gras. Then what happens is much later, several months later, in line with its normal flu season, Louisiana has an epidemic in all the other parishes. But there was not even a second spike in the Mardi Gras parishes, despite the fact that all the parishes around them were having their first spike. So it's very interesting. It's a fascinating sort of area of study. So you just be careful of people superimposing separate epidemic charts from different regions and telling you that that's a second wave. And then the third thing is minor. I've only ever heard it used a couple of times, but in lots of countries, South Africa being an example, Australia being another example, you had a tiny little first wave when you had returning ski trippers from the winter in the Northern Hemisphere who arrived with coronavirus, and they maybe infected a few people, or a few cases were registered in relation to them. Then that doesn't really take hold into any kind of distribution of the disease through the community. No, you wait until the beginning of your flu season, and then you get the coronavirus epidemic emerging on a much larger scale. So those are three examples of second waves that aren't second waves. And my advice to you, for the time being, until somebody comes along with really hard evidence, you have to view these claims with a lot of suspicion. Of course, what I'm not saying here is that we will never see coronavirus again. Our expectation, and we could be wrong, is that this will become another one of many background respiratory diseases that circulate around the world every year, alongside influenza, rhinoviruses, other coronaviruses that cause the common cold, adenoviruses. There's several of these families of viruses that do go around the world, and every year they infect people, they make them sick, and they will even kill a few, usually old or very sick people. So, just there will be a seasonal return of coronavirus, but it's not going to be on a level comparable to what we saw now with the novelty of this virus going around the world, probably for the first time, we think.
Thank you, Nick. We have lots of votes of appreciation coming through for all of you, from people like Marianne Bardenhorst. We have Peter Haslam, Richard Lawton, many others commenting, expressing their thanks. We have a question here from Peter Haslam. He says, thanks for the prezo. Has there been any recent engagement by the government or other bodies with PANDA?
Yes, we had some engagement with the NICD a couple of weeks ago. I'm not too sure that it achieved much because we haven't seen a new model out of them. We did have engagement in May, and then there was a long period of silence. And it has been disappointing for us because, as time went by and what we were saying became more and more evident to be true, you would have thought that somebody would have picked up the phone, but it was not to be. And it has resulted, in a terrible misallocation of resources. It's quite a shame. We have so many healthcare challenges in this country, and to be throwing so much by way of resources at relatively inconsequential disease when so many others present such a challenge is just, a shame. I think these what's the chickens that still have to come home to roost are what happened to all the people who were too scared or unable to go near a hospital during the whole lockdown. I mean, it's not as if hospitals don't save people on an average month. They do. Of course, our doctors and our nurses do a fantastic job. They work in very tough conditions in the public hospitals, better conditions in the private hospitals, but they certainly save people. And so when those people are not in the hospitals, you can only imagine what's happening to them. The cancer cases that are going undiagnosed, operations that should be happening, minor diabetic ulcers that should be treated that now are resulting in people losing their limbs and that kind of thing. There are a lot. We will hear a lot more about this, I'm afraid, as the consequences of that massive diversion of resources come home.
Nick, another question is by Eleutheria Zete. He says, considering how big corporates happily rolled over for the lockdown, I recommend supporting small businesses as far as possible and pay cash. Now, I know, Nick, that you and PANDA and others have been engaged with some big companies in South Africa doing private presentations, I understand. But could you elaborate a little bit? Because we're seeing a sort of schism, it appears. Business for Ending Lockdown it's an association like the National Employers Association, the LWO Employers Association, a couple of other business organizations. And we're seeing more and more of them saying end lockdown. But we're not saying these from some of the other business organizations. What has your engagement been with business, companies, organized or individual?
One of the most disappointing things for me has been the entirely supine attitude of big business in South Africa, whether through the business organizations or as individual companies. I mean, I won't. Let's be fair. They've all, or many of them, have engaged in funding PPE acquisition stories and trying to support the health department in rollout of these field hospitals and so on, and that's admirable work. But the really important view that needed to be taken straight on, right at the beginning, was that this lockdown was a bad idea. Continuation of the lockdown was a bad idea. But they did exactly the opposite. They kind of, rolled over and had their tummies tickled. And that was very disappointing for me. I have a good network of CEOs, and I spoke to all of them. I couldn't get any of them to speak out. Couldn't get any of them to. A lot of them agreed with me in private. That's how it went. So my message to small businesses is, if you're looking for support, you aren't going to get it from big business or from the big business organizations. You're not going to get it from government. You're going to have to do it yourselves. And we will obviously do what we can. But, what we see as being the thing that can help small businesses is to encourage a rapid end to lockdown and removal in their entirety of the regulations. They're all absurd. A return to life as normal as quickly as possible, and then further deregulation to enable business to reestablish itself, to enable capital formation to take place. I have great respect for entrepreneurs. They're my favorite people in the world. I love working with them. I'm privileged to work with them in my job on a day-to-day basis, and that I have great admiration for entrepreneurs. And so I know a resource for people they are, and we just need to make it possible for them to do their magic.
Nick, I'd like to move to Hans and Russell. Hans, Russell, we have questions coming in on sectoral impacts. Hans, with the regulations as they stand, the level 2 regulations, there's a little bit of I wouldn't say complacency, but there's such a relief that we're at level 2 and not level 3 anymore that one could almost think that it's going better, but that's just because it's by comparison to what we had a few weeks ago. What do you see and expect to see in the data with regard to industries like the entertainment industry and others who are severely limited by these mix of 50% of floor space usage, maximum of 50 people, etc.? Does that have a real effect on the economy or not?
So, I mean, you could look at lockdown levels and segment it by industries, but I think if you look at the overall economic activity to what Russell was showing, it's suppressed. So we have lots of businesses living with 50, 60, 70% of their previous volumes. They've done as much as they can in terms of cutting costs, right? So they've minimized the workforce, they've gathered discounts, they've gotten certain allowances from big business and governments. However, the credit obligations and the payments that they need to operate still remain. So I think various industries will be hit harder than others as we go through the various stages. But that doesn't take away the need to lift the overall economic activity as quickly as possible to the normal levels. Now, as Nick said, I think a lot of businesses have the agility and the entrepreneurial spirit to reimagine their business to a certain extent. But if you're dealing with a much lower pie, it's going to be very difficult for everyone. So obviously, as we look at other industries coming online, I mean, best hope is that they'll be able to look at alternative revenue streams and get back to normal as quickly as possible. But rather than focusing on any one industry, I think it's about getting an overall lift in the economy that's immensely important for me.
Russell, you could add to that, but I'd like to also ask some of the comments also go in this direction. What are the possibilities for businesses to make judgment calls of their own and to manage the risk they perceive? Because what I'm sensing, of course, is that there'll still be some disagreement and some variation in the way people understand and approach their personal risks and the risks of their clients. From an economist's perspective, what's going to happen if all regulations become voluntary?
You know, Pete, at the risk of sounding like a stuck record, but we are, I suppose, 160 days into the lockdown, so maybe I have to be a stuck record. We've said from the outset that decentralized risk management, personalized risk management is the answer, where you're managing risk for yourself, for your family, for your community, for your organization. Everyone across this country faces tremendously different risks. People have different health risks and to COVID. People live in different cities, different circumstances. Some people are rural and isolated. Some people are urban and live in high density, poor income, low income areas. So I mean, as South Africans, we are just tremendously diverse, and that requires a diversity of approaches. It's also in a diversity of approaches that you actually do get tremendous robustness and tremendous resilience of a system. Single approaches are at risk of single points of failure. So that's an overarching comment. And then to answer your question specifically, but it flows from that first comment. To think that businesses, let's take restaurants for example, across the country have to enact exactly the same protocols for their customers, and to think that all customers have to react in exactly the same way to those protocols is just, it just doesn't work. Businesses can choose the safety measures that they believe are appropriate, and customers can choose whether they want to frequent those establishments, whether they require more safety measures, in which case they can complain to those businesses and the businesses can respond to those complaints. I mean, this is how a market works. This is why we have a market for goods and services. That would just slot straight into the same sort of thinking. There's now a market for health and safety, and there's a desire for varying kinds of health and safety. Certain people will want to go to establishments, for example, let's say restaurants, that are with tables, widely spaced out, and where protocols are very strictly followed. And other people simply don't want to do that, and nor do they necessarily need to, particularly if they regard themselves in a low-risk group. So I think it's absolutely essential that we let people voluntarily manage their risk and apply their own particular personal and business circumstances to the problem at hand. That is how we create a robust response.
Thank you, Russell. And Nick, back to you, I think, with this question. Richard Lawton has repeated this question a couple of times. He wants to ask you about the age distribution of the South African population, how that compares to other age distributions in other countries and the relevance of that. If you could just perhaps revisit that point and make the implications clear for what we should expect and how you factored those into your predictions.
Yeah. So this was an important point at the beginning of the story, before we had any observations in our own country to draw upon, and we were looking at the rest of the world. And you can see there that the mortality rates are affected by the age structure of the country. And that slide that I showed you with South Africa having about, I think it's 20 to 25% as many old people as Belgium. That makes an enormous difference that we have. And that's part of the reason why we're looking at probably ending up somewhere in the region of 250 to 300 deaths per million rather than the 800 and something deaths per million that Belgium experienced. So it's not a straight line relationship that you can draw from one country to the next. There are other factors that are relevant. One of them seems to be, the kind of condition of the population as a result of hard lockdown. I mean, we think that's a relevant factor here. But South Africa has got a younger population, and it's by no means the youngest in the world. Vietnam and other countries in the rest of Africa have significantly younger populations. They're almost negligible numbers of people over the age of 65 because they get taken out by other diseases all the time. That's the meaning of being poor. So yeah, I mean, we do have a younger population. I think it's fair to say our experience is probably worse than average. If you looked at our model of intercountry differences, we would have predicted we did predict a lower number of deaths than we're expecting to end up on. Time will tell. We should be able to tease out of the information what the drivers of that were and whether the intensity and severity of our lockdown had anything to do with it. I hope that answers your question, Richard. I might be taking it in the wrong direction. If so, I apologize.
Thank you, Nick. As we head into the final minutes of this presentation, I'd like a round of final remarks from Russell, Hans, and Nick. Russell, can we start with you?
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, look, I think I've probably said what I need to say. I just want to emphasize the enormity and the gravity of what it means to shut down a country, to shut down an economy, to shut down a social system on the basis of such incredibly weak and flimsy evidence and justification. And I suppose, let me end on this point. A point Nick and I presented to a group last night. One of the questions that came up was this idea of, well, under conditions of extreme uncertainty, and facing what statisticians call fat tail risks. In other words, things that if they go wrong can go really wrong. Can really sort of spiral out of control. Under those sorts of potential conditions, isn't it wise to lock down, to take these immense precautions? And I think that there's a very, very basic and fundamental error there. I think it's precisely under conditions of tremendous uncertainty and precisely under conditions where you have so-called fat tail risk potential in all directions, including when you institute lockdowns. You can trigger off tremendous unforeseen consequences, which I think we have done. And it's precisely under those conditions that you need an alert kind of status quo, right? An alert status quo where you say, we're going to wait for better information. We're going to share the best information with our population. We're going to allow people the maximum amount of freedom to manage their risks. And we're going to allow for a multiplicity of approaches to risk management at a provincial level, at a municipal level, at a community and family level, and at an individual and business level. And I think it's precisely because of the uncertainty that we go that route. And it's, a question like that, where you are worried about something like coronavirus spiraling out of control, presupposes that that's the only risk that can spiral out of control, where we know now lockdown has set in motion a range of political and economic and social forces that we don't quite know how to control and where those are going to go. And those could indeed spiral out of control to a degree. If we increase the poverty headcount in South Africa by a few 100,000 additional people through the course of the next year and beyond, what does that mean for South Africa socially? What does it mean for us politically and economically? And that would just be one of many, many considerations. So what I'd like to leave people with is that lockdowns are a deeply radical policy. They're not a conservative policy. They turn the whole concept of risk management into a radical approach where you have a one-size-fits-all approach for 60 million people in a very complex environment. That mustn't be allowed to happen again. And you know, as we look forward into the future, we need to oppose the idea that lockdowns are ever appropriate. If the virus is relatively mild, like we've seen with COVID, it's unjustified. If the virus is very, very severe, it's also unjustified because people will take their own evasive action. And if the virus is supremely severe, then the government itself can't even enforce the lockdown because government officials themselves will be succumbing to the virus. So in any kind of instance, we need to defer to decentralized risk management. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you very much, Russell. Final remark from you, Hans.
Sure, thanks, Pete. So, you know, a lot of, you can look at this and you can say, well, is the South African economy over? Is that it for us? And I fundamentally don't think so. I think, yeah, economy, just businesses in general need a bit of help, need a bit of a repair, but I don't think it's over. I think as we see the lockdown regulations, you know, diminish, we do see additional activity in the market. But you know, something that I'd just like to echo is that you do need to keep looking for your own opportunities. Waiting, you know, trying to kind of look for the thing to land on your lap isn't going to happen. You know, what we have seen is that businesses that have taken the opportunities, they've gone after what they see in front of them. They've optimized their business. They've chosen to reinvent, reimagine, approach customers in a different way, and fundamentally focusing on offering a great product to the market in a niche that requires it is, you know, I mean, good business still makes good sense. However, what I would also say is to the point around reacting to fear and uncertainty, you know, now is not the time to give into that level of panic and just fear, but to rather look at the data, look at the information, and trade carefully, but trade deliberately, and look to seize the opportunities on the outside. I mean, this too shall pass, and we'll be on the other side of it. And I think it will be an absolute tragedy for me if South Africa, as a country, as a business community, that we haven't taken all the chances we could have to come and rise out of this this crisis in the strongest way possible. So whatever you want to call it, building your COVID or post-COVID resilience, climbing the curve on the other time, taking opportunities. I think we do need to look to the future. We do need to create, you know, move into the space that's created by the lockdown ending in its various forms. And really make the best of the opportunities on the other side.
Thank you very much, Hans. Nick, a final remark and also a question from the Brew member who's posed the question, I think, on the Morning Shot, a YouTube channel who's also streaming this event. He asks, when does the lockdown project end? So, Nick, as we head into your closing remark, also could you address that? When do we see an end to this, and what can we do to expedite its end?
It does depend on us a bit. We have to really all continue to press as hard as we can for the end to this ridiculous state of disaster. Its extension is, in my opinion, a human rights violation and a crime against humanity. It's just absurd. And we need to treat it with the scorn that it deserves. You know, so yeah, when as soon as possible in my book, but it's we can't take its end at the end of this month. In other words, on the 15th of September for granted. It should never have been renewed once. But I think the pressure's building, and I think people are waking up to the devastation and to the inappropriateness of lockdown and the state of disaster. We think it's actually unconstitutional. We would have taken that case if we thought it had a chance of wrapping up quickly enough, but that's a multi-year process and one which we'll indulge in, but down the line. Yeah, I want to finish with a closing remark. What motivated us as PANDA to get together and to produce this effort was a sense of an enormous injustice emerging in lockdown. And I think all of us felt, that knowing what we knew with the perspective that we had on the virus and on lockdown, that we would never be able to look our children in the eyes again if we didn't stand up and try and do something about it. And that motivation, I tell you, when you carry that motivation for 5 months as we have, you wake up many mornings as angry as can be. I mean, it's happened to me just several times every week. I wake up and I'm just furious with so many people. And I can see that in the comments box. I can see other people sharing that feeling. And I just want to talk a little bit about what the challenge is and how we have to bottle that anger up a little bit, use it in its appropriate times. Out there are a lot of scared people, and you can't talk to people who are scared with anger. It takes a great deal of empathy. The psychological framework of this fear is complicated. It's been such a phenomenal thing to see. It's quite frightening, actually. But you begin to understand how great tragedies have happened elsewhere in the world. The purges of Stalin and Mao, and the huge successes in Germany of Hitler and so on. You begin to see the herd mentality, how it takes shape. People want company in their fear. They want other people to be sharing the fear. They do not want to hear that you're not scared. And so I think it requires extraordinary levels of empathy to engage with people and to work out how to placate the fears, to get them to see the world clearly, to get them to start resuming their normal lives. And I would just appeal to everybody to approach the task in that fashion. We're all very angry. We all want to shout. I shout all the time. I can't help myself. But there's a time for that when you're talking to people who need to change the policies and the people who are just insouciant about their role in setting up this disaster and unable to stand down from their positions. Those people need to be dealt with hard. But our fellow citizens need to be dealt with very gently. And my appeal to people would be to spend some time thinking, try and put yourself in the position of somebody who is afraid, somebody who believes that there's a big bad virus out there waiting around every corner to kill them. How do you engage with such a person who's believed that for months? What kind of psychological position are they in? That takes a lot of empathy. It's something I want to study some more. We need to talk to more psychologists about this, to more physicians about this, how to undo this fear. It's really required, and work that I think requires a great deal of insight and empathy, as I say. So that's my closing remark, other than just to say, wonderful job to Business for Ending Lockdown. Put this together in a very short order. It's great work. It's an initiative that was overdue. As I said, big business is not looking after you. So we're going to have to do it ourselves. And we're thoroughly supportive of this great initiative. Well done to the team.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for those kind remarks, and gentlemen, to this presentation. Right from the beginning, when Business for Ending Lockdown was formed, PANDA was there to advise us, together with other wonderful people like Davi Ruet, Mike Schussler, Vusi Tembekwayo, Pumlani Majosi, Johannes Wessels, and others from various affiliations. And also thank you very much to the other organizations who form Business for Ending Lockdown. Myself, I'm a CEO of Sakaliga. We are one of others, including the National Employers Association of South Africa, the LWO Employers Association, the Restaurant Association of South Africa, Federated Hospitality Association, FEDASA, SAI, South African Agricultural Initiative, and also TLU SA, another agricultural organization. And we are happy to expand our ranks. Thousands of people have joined and commented on endlockdown.co.za. So the call to action is for everybody who's watching this, please share this information and visit endlockdown.co.za. Leave a comment, tell us what's happened to your business, and support this call to end lockdown.